wonderful to see you, man. It's been far too long, and I'm just really glad they're here. Welcome to Schiller and Hamilton podcast.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I love your place. This studio, you got like the Joe Rogan 5000 edition
right.
podcast studio. This is amazing. Y'all done a great job.
Yeah, well, it's just along with everyone else in the country, I guess. I am a Joe Rogan fan, so it was kind of cool to kind of put it together and kind of put our own spin on it. But I want to talk, you have such a crazy background. We were just kind of joking about how you have like 4 different full-time jobs, and then you decided to add something else to your plate, which I'm excited to talk about. But tell us a little bit about everything else that you do first.
Well, I'm Matt Hiers. Been in Rock Hill since I was about 7 years old. We moved up here in 1987 and graduated from public schools here from Northwestern. Went on to the Citadel in Charleston. Graduated in 2001 and came back to work up here in Rock Hill in the Charlotte area. And really, we talked a little bit about my past. Mm-hmm. I was a rambunctious, I would guess, 20-year-old and mm-hmm. bounced around from selling concrete in Charlotte for a concrete distributor to bartending to a little bit of everything else until finally decided to straighten up. By the grace of God, I did, mm-hmm. Able to get my life back on track, and I have been now with Williams Fudge Incorporated for actually 4 years today. Today was my anniversary. I also work with OTS Media, or WRHI, as most people refer to it, on Friday nights in the fall, and I broadcast high school football games, so my voice may be familiar to some folks. Mm-hmm. Most of the time I do Northwestern games with Chris Miller. Mm-hmm. I serve as his color analyst. I'm the Robin to his Batman, I say.
Yeah.
And we enjoy that. That's a labor of love. And also now we're starting our own podcast, both me and I'm doing it along with my sister-in-law who works for SLED. It's Carolina Crimes.
Nice. And I'll also add, I believe I've been to at least one wedding for which you served as the officiant.
That's right. I wear many hats. I wear many hats. Yes.
That's awesome.
Yes.
Man, I can only imagine. I don't know how you have time to do all this between, and I know what it's like broadcasting for a football game. What people see is just like the tip of the iceberg for the amount of work that must go into that. I can't imagine the research and the time spent getting to know the players and the rosters and the teams and just being able to just throw out all these stats and everything at a moment's notice.
Well, it does, and I guess that's what made me realize really I was a nerd, mm-hmm. and I love to research things. My Friday night prep, I usually spend anywhere between 7 and 9 hours, especially if it's 2 teams that I've never broadcast before, just diving into stats, diving into the players' backgrounds, because what it's all about on Friday nights is getting these guys over. Yeah. These young men that are out there on the field playing, you want to be able to recognize them. You want them to be able to put their best face forward and really represent them in a good way.
Yeah, and it's pretty cool to get your name on the radio or TV or something like that when you're out there playing. That's like every kid's dream, right?
Right. I was an offensive lineman, so I never got that. They never get the recognition unless you get a holding penalty or
yeah, they only get it when something
like
bad happens, right?
That's right.
Well, I'm excited to talk about this new project because, like I said, you're adding one more thing to your plate, but it sounds like it's going to be a ton of fun, or already is a ton of fun. So tell me about Carolina Crimes podcast. How did you get the idea for this, and kind of where are we, and how did it start?
Okay, what Carolina Crimes is, of course, you said it's a new podcast. It's available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio now. Mm-hmm. As of 2 days ago, they picked it up. Really anywhere podcasts are heard. What it is, it's the only weekly episodic podcast dedicated to the true crimes of South Carolina. Mm. So there's, having
no shortage of stories there, I'm sure, right?
There's a lot of podcasts out there. There's a ton of true crime podcasts out there. There seems to be a lot of interest in that.
Yeah.
But none really specific to the state of South Carolina. And there is like you said, a ton of material.
Well, you seem to be really honing in on like a critical thesis or idea for a podcast, because all I know is anecdotally, like my wife sits there and watches true crime stuff on Netflix like nightly. Yes. She loves that stuff. And and that seems to be just a growing genre of entertainment or media. But like you said, I haven't heard of anyone or anything focusing on any specific geography, let alone our own state. And what have you found? I mean, you must have started with the idea that, okay, there's so many things here. Are you surprised by just the mountain of stories? I mean, do you feel like it's almost infinite?
Absolutely. We could do this. I'm 41. We could do this till I'm 100 years old, and we're gonna have a new episode weekly, and we wouldn't run out of material.
So how far back are you going? Because this state, South Carolina, has been around for a long time.
So far, we've got 3 episodes out. The earliest one we've done, it started in 1940. We're talking about going back to the 1700s to the first female serial killer in South Carolina, Lavinia Fisher, down in Charleston. Getting involved some of the pirate crimes in the 1600s. I mean, we're going to dive into some of that too.
And there's some rather notorious characters, like Blackbeard was active along the South Carolina coast during that time, I'm sure.
Right, and it surprised me reading about the blockades of these pirates, and that you could actually block off an entire city at that point in time, and any kind of goods, treasures, rum, food, textiles coming in or out of the port, you could just plunder it and pick what you wanted.
Can you imagine, like, going to Charleston and say, who are those folks out there? Oh, they're just the pirates. They're blockading the city.
Yeah.
Like, what in the world? I can't imagine anything like that happening now. Is there, I imagine you've kind of come across a lot, but is there a particular story recently that you've come across that you're just really excited for that episode? You can't wait to get it out there.
Yes, it was the.
And I don't want you to give it away, but
I'm not giving any. I'm not giving any spoilers.
Exactly.
You got to listen in on Apple Podcast, but it was a story. The one that I talked about from 1940. It was in Edgefield County, and it started off with a mule that wandered off of one farmer's property onto another's, and it ended up kicking a calf to death. So you got livestock on livestock murder, not really that exciting. Well, that set off this chain of events where you had adultery, murder for hire, the sheriff of Edgefield County got shot, armed standoffs, and even a U.S. senator was actually one of the centerpieces of this story. And it is wild, and it's one you've got to listen to from beginning to end. There's twists and turns all over it.
Is that one that's out already?
It's episode 3.
Nice.
Yes, that's called A Mule, a Murder for Hire, and Muscular Dexterity. And I'm not going to get into the muscular dexterity part here on your podcast. I don't think it's explicit, but it's a pretty wild tale. It was even featured in the London Examiner at that time. So
this was a story that had went worldwide or went viral. It was the 1940s version of viral.
Yeah, it went worldwide, and it was something that I'd never heard of or never could have imagined.
Yeah.
And I ran across it at about 12:30 at night, laying in bed reading, scrolling, and I had to keep reading it again. And the next morning I said, I had to have dreamt that. That's so wild and bizarre. That's outrageous, but yeah, it's the truth.
So was there a particular story or crime that you came across that inspired this whole project?
I think we got inspired. Now, I have a co-host. We've talked about her, Danielle Myers.
Yeah.
She's my sister-in-law. She works for SLED down in the Columbia area, and she deals a lot with the sex offender registry. Well, she's a nerd too. She's even a bigger nerd than me, and she enjoys anytime you see her with a book. She's reading about true crime or researching some kind of true crime, an anthology or these big reference books. And when we'd get together on family vacations, we'd kind of start swapping books and, hey, have you read this? Or, hey, have you looked at this or heard about this case? And we always go to Fripp Island where you ride around on the golf carts. And so me and my wife and Danielle and my brother, we'd ride around all hours of the night, and it eventually divulged into these conversations where we'd talk about these true crimes and these cases and how wild they were. And how the investigators, this is my favorite part, how the investigators end up really finding out who perpetrated these crimes.
Yeah.
So we'd ride around all hours of the night talking about it, and we started thinking, and we said, hey, why don't we, throw a line in the water, see if we could do a podcast about it.
That's awesome. And I love the idea because it seems so organic between the two of you. It's almost just like someone's going to just put some microphone in between a conversation you'd be having anyway.
And that's what we like to have. I mean, yes, we're presenting the facts, but we also, I think one of the highlights and what's going to set us apart from other true crime podcasts are our opinions. We're just not reading off a page. We're just not telling you the story. We're going to put our 2 cents into, and folks may agree or not.
Have you come across anything that makes you think, I wonder if the investigators got this wrong? Or I wonder if the person that was actually convicted might not have actually been the perpetrator or something that was missed?
There's one, and that did happen. It's an upcoming episode where a man was convicted of murdering his wife. And 2 years later, this guy comes forward and starts... It was a killer that wanted to be caught. He was a serial killer, and he ended up contacting the editor of a local newspaper and telling him where these bodies could be found, and he would go with the sheriff and find them, and then finally he led him to an area where there was no body, but it was the place that the lady was found 2 years before, and her husband was sitting in prison for murder.
Wow.
And when he was caught, this murderer eventually said, it's odd to believe that there's a serial killer with a conscience, but he said, I just can't let another man serve time for what I did.
Wow.
And he had gotten away with it scot-free.
But it wasn't killing somebody that was weighing on his conscience. It was the fact that somebody else was sitting in jail for it.
Right.
Wow. Of all the times to have a crisis of morality, that's where it finally hits you.
And that's going to be the title of it. It's going to be The Serial Killer with a Conscience.
Wow. That's going to be one I'm going to look forward to.
Yeah. So that's going to be coming out in a few weeks.
You're obviously a self-proclaimed nerd. So does the interest in the historical crimes, does that come more from an interest in crimes or history, or is it just the combination that really gets you going?
A little bit of both, I'll say. And I started thinking back about when I was interested in true crime, and I'd have to go all the way back to when I was probably around 5 or 6 years old. Can't remember exactly when, but my mother and I came home one afternoon. She had picked me up after work from my grandparents and brought me home, and we walked in the house, and everything was in disarray. The cabinets were open, dishes were down, it looked like clothes were strewn everywhere, and she immediately said, well, why did your dad come home from lunch and do this? What's going on? And it finally clicked, hey, we've been robbed.
Wow.
And little did we know that across the street in the barn, the two guys that had robbed our house, they had set up a little torch, a camping torch, and they were going to sit in the barn and watch the house burn down.
What?
And they said in court, they said, well, we saw the little boy and the woman come home, and we started getting worried then, but I don't think there was enough propane or something in the torch that just for some reason didn't take.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
So what,
and that
was it just a random
It was
crime?
Just 2 random juveniles that had escaped from a local juvenile facility, and they were going around, and about a mile down the road, they had fixed themselves something to eat. They came to our house and changed clothes and took showers and went and stole a truck from some other neighbor. But I remember that night having to take a bath upstairs because downstairs all the detectives were there and scurrying around and taking fingerprints. And I just thought that was the awesomest thing, that, hey, these guys can do that. They're going to be able to tell who did this and who climbed in the window and broke my Castle Grayskull. They're going to find this guy.
That's really cool that your reaction wasn't like you weren't scared. You were just really interested in what was going on with the police work.
Yeah, and the more I thought about it had to go back to that. And then, of course, growing up with the shows, the America's Most Wanted with John Walsh, and
that used to keep me up at night when I was younger.
Unsolved Mysteries with Robert Stack. I mean, I never missed an episode of those. So I was always interested in that.
So it's obviously started at a really young age. So in South Carolina, obviously probably everyone listening to this knows, but for anyone that doesn't know, South Carolina, everywhere you look is history, especially if you're somewhere down the coast, you're in Charleston or Beaufort or Port Royal. You're talking about some of the oldest settlements in the country, and a lot of them still look like it. You know, it's not like other areas where they tear down their history. Our history is right there in front of you. Do you think just being a product of South Carolina, those kind of trips maybe to Charleston or Beaufort or Fripp Island you mentioned, and just being in front of and seeing and encountering history just while wherever you are, do you think that maybe inspired a little bit of interest as well?
It had to have. That, and I had parents that really got me involved in it. I mentioned we moved to Rock Hill in 1987. Well, we moved from Walterboro, which is about 40 miles west of Charleston. So constant trips to Charleston, going to the Battery, Charlestown Landing, the first real settlement where folks came to Charleston, actually. Doing that and going on school trips all around and learning about history. And then, of course, we move up here to Rock Hill, and we're in the Old English District. Yeah. And then I get to experience Brattonsville and a whole new set of history. I attribute it to my parents and, of course, the setting here in South Carolina.
And I kind of feel like what you're doing is a continuation. It's almost like an adaptation of technology to a tradition of oral history in South Carolina, where the oral history tradition here is so rich. Like when you go to Charleston, everyone there whose granddaddy, 11 centuries or 11 generations back has some story, but they tell that story generation after generation after generation to where it feels like it just happened yesterday because you're looking at the house or you're looking at wherever, the story took place is right in front of you, and it just feels so alive. Do you kind of feel almost like an obligation to tell these stories? To kind of continue that tradition, or I feel like there's a lot of public good in what you're doing, to be honest with you.
I've never thought about it that way, but yes, when it comes down to it, to just keep these stories alive. A lot of the more recent crimes, especially for the victims, the victims' families, there's nothing you can do to help these people bring their loved one back or gain some kind of peace. But maybe we can just give some kind of peace of mind by keeping the story alive, by being reverent toward the victims or their family members. And that's a lot of what I've learned from the books of Rita Schiller that we talked about before we went on the air. Yeah. Rita Schiller, for those of you that don't know, she was the head forensic photographer for SLED, the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division. We've said SLED about 15 times, but just if no one's familiar with that term. Miss Schiller, she was the head forensic photographer for close to 30 years for them. And she has authored several great books. One of them is entitled, actually, Carolina Crimes, The Chronicles of a Forensic Photographer. Wow. And South Carolina Slayings. And I think she has two more. But we use those as reference books almost. They're large anthologies of these crimes that have occurred in South Carolina, where she outlines the evidence, exactly what happened, and how these folks were caught. Also, an interesting aspect that's come up it's something you're familiar with, are the trials. Yeah. And how wild some of these are. So, and the appeals process. I'm starting to familiarize myself more with these when you're like, well, hey, what happened to the bad guy here at the end of the story? Everybody wants to know. Yeah. And how many of these appeals, how they can base these appeals, it's amazing to me. Are you finding that it's hard to fit these stories into a time constraint? Absolutely. Yeah, I can only imagine, like, where do you stop? Because everywhere you look, there's just so much detail that's interesting, right? Right, and we try to keep them to about an hour. And, of course, the first one was an hour and 40 minutes. Of course. So but isn't that what's so great about this genre or this format is you can just talk. And there's not – you have to stop and,
5 minutes for a commercial or anything like that. You can just talk about it.
And I've only had the feedback so far has been phenomenal, but I think only one person said, well, the first episode was a little long. It wasn't a bad review or anything, but yeah, you're right. It was a little long.
Yeah, because it's interesting.
Yeah, but from now on, one of the episodes we're recording this weekend is going to have to be a two-parter. Yeah. There's just too much information, and I'll go ahead and let folks know that one is going to be one of the more famous crimes in South Carolina that we try to do very sparingly, but it's going to be about Susan Smith in Union County.
Yeah. And that one's of particular relevance because it's so close, and it's also geographically, but it's also so recent in a lot of people's memory. Right. I mean, it was what, 25 years ago, 20 years ago?
27.
27? God, that long ago?
I'm sorry. 94.
Okay.
94.
So yeah, but for a lot of people, that's still recent memory.
Right.
And of course, everyone knows, Tommy Pope being the prosecutor and being on CNN, and
right.
And I'm looking forward to that one. You're right. There's no way you could fit that in an hour.
No, and what we're doing is a comprehensive look too. We don't want to leave any stone unturned, and there's a lot about Susan's background. That was the most surprising part when we started researching that case. There's so much about her background that really explains how her mind was so twisted there at the end, and really explained, hey, this person needed some help way before this. And
for one that's so recent, are you able to get first-person accounts and talk to people who were involved?
Yes, and we were very lucky. Our first episode took place in Conway, South Carolina, and actually the editor of My Ori News, Kathy Ropp, she was involved with the investigation of the case back in 1991. So she took a lot of time and spoke with me and gave me some facts and stories that I could use, and she was invaluable. She was an invaluable resource as well. So some of these more recent ones, we are getting first-person narratives, and some of the local ones, local cases we're going to cover, also want to have some eyewitnesses.
Yeah.
To that.
So you're talking to some of the people that are involved. Are you maybe, if there's a story that really interests you, like this one in the mule and the what was the mule and what else?
A mule, a murder for hire, and muscular dexterity.
So one of those, have you thought about traveling to where it actually took place and kind of seeing and getting pictures or anything like that?
Our first travel trip is going to be the third week of June. We are going to. It's actually going to be in Fripp Island when we're on vacation. We're gonna actually set up a video and go to the scene of the crime, because at Fripp Island there was a case where a man faked his own death back in the early 80s, and he had been involved in an embezzlement scheme, and that's a pretty bizarre one as well. So we're going to take you right to where the body was found and be right there on scene.
Wow. That's pretty crazy. So which one is your absolute favorite so far? Is it the mule one?
So far, yes.
Yeah.
And we'll talk off air because, like I said, I don't want to give any spoilers, but that's crazy. I keep using these adjectives, but I don't want to give away the end or what happened. But 8 people ended up dead because of a mule kick, and it's just fascinating how things snowballed downhill, and then you throw in one of the most famous South Carolinians ever, and it gets even more bizarre.
It's like the butterfly that flaps its wings, and then you get like a hurricane and on the other side of the country.
Right. If this guy would have kept his fences up and mended, none of this would have happened, and probably all these people would have been living happy lives.
Which kind of begs the question, is that common? Or so are most of these crimes that you're researching, do they kind of start, or do they seem to be sparked from a random act? Are they crimes of passion normally? Are they crimes that involve some type of prior relationship that's just gone bad? Are they domestic? Like, what seems to be some common themes for you?
Mental health issue. Well, that's kind of anticlimactic, because I mean, if you're going to take somebody's life, there's obviously got to be something wrong with you mentally. Yeah. But mental health, greed, need for security or attention, Those are some of the overlying themes. So,
that's really interesting to me because it's entertaining. Like you said, you're coming at it from a place of reverence for the victims and the families. You're carrying on a tradition, but at the end of the day, you're doing a deep dive into human behavior, right?
Right.
In an extreme form of human behavior. And so you're getting like this up close look of actions and people that most people kind of only have a surface understanding of. And you mentioned the mental health aspect. What has that done for your own awareness or understanding of how these sort of actions or behaviors occur?
Getting on the mental health aspect, I would say it needs to be more talked about. Help needs to be more readily available for folks, because a lot of these things, like the Susan Smith case, I mean, she lived an awful, awful life below the surface of what she put forth in union prior to what she did to her children. And you got to think, if she had some folks that really cared about her or counselors that really dug deeper and got to the root of the problem and got her the help she needed, that Michael and Alex would have still been alive today. Yeah. I believe that for a fact.
Do you feel like that's pretty common too from what you're finding, that intervention could have meant prevention in a lot of these cases?
100%. 100%. Or I won't say 100% because there are some folks that we're coming across that were just broken from the get-go. And I don't mean that in a condescending way, but they're just not all the cylinders were firing upstairs.
Yeah.
So and we're going over a case now for a couple weeks that the man, he did have mental disabilities. And I don't mean that to be disparaging to folks that have mental challenges, but he's never going to stand trial for what he did. And he's in a facility where he gets the mental help that he needs, and he will eventually die there. But he'll never have to answer in a court of law for the atrocities that he did. And you got to think he may have not have known what he was doing, which is even more troubling. That
is troubling. Yeah, and you wonder. Yeah, there's a lot of questions there. You kind of wonder what part of his psyche just isn't quite firing correctly to where that understanding isn't there.
Yeah, and that's above my pay grade.
Me too.
Yeah, I just tell the stories and what I think about them.
Well, you mentioned your interest too, and how you kind of how this may have been what actually sparked all this is your interest in like the detective work at the crime that happened at your own home when you were younger. And one thing that's kind of fascinating to me is how technology has changed that and how that's changed over time. And you're going back and looking at all these crimes from, very somewhat recent, 1994. But even today, compared to 1994, we've made amazing like forensic advances to be able to solve some of these crimes. But can you imagine working with some of the tools that these people were working with 100 years ago or 200 years ago and trying to figure out? Like those guys must have just been like superheroes to be able to figure out who committed a crime back then. I mean, what were they going off of?
And back then, you almost 100% had to get a confession. That was the only foolproof method, besides if you stuck your finger in blood and stuck it on somebody's forehead that you murdered, and that fingerprint was there. Yeah, I mean, you didn't have any other concrete 100% evidence.
So you basically had to get caught. You had to have someone see you, or you had to have that confession moment where you said, "Hey guys, it was me." So you had to have a crisis of morality, like we talked about with the one guy,
right?
Or I don't know, like what compels someone to come forward after something like that, other than just their own conscience weighing on them. I'm not sure, but I can't imagine being in a position in Charleston in 1820 and trying to figure out where the dead body in the street came from.
Right, or you'd have to rely, besides on confession, on witnesses.
Yeah,
that would be another thing. And with some of these, I get so frustrated, I think most of all when we're researching these cases with the witnesses, because some of them are just so unreliable. Some of them will make things up on their own, out of their own subjectivity. and it gets so frustrating. I'm sure for me, but I'm sure for the investigators. Like we had one in episode 1, a man that said, "Oh, I saw the girl that was found raped and murdered. I saw her car. I passed by, and there were 2 people standing beside it." And he told the police, and they started investigating it. And the sketches that they were able to come up with were the mother and the mother's boyfriend of the girl that was missing.
Oh, wow.
And they said, "Oh, so you saw it at night?" And he said, "Well, I was really drunk. It may have been the next morning." And they admitted they found the car the next morning. So
yeah,
here's this guy saying, "Oh, I'm a witness, but I was driving around Conway drunk, and I didn't know, I was so drunk I couldn't tell if it was day or night." So I can just
wow. What do you do with that as a prosecutor? That falls apart on the stand real quick.
Right. You think you have a hot lead on something if you're an investigator, and then it comes back to be nothing, and you're back at square one, and that's just got to be demoralizing. And I don't know how these investigators, they just have just the fortitude to keep going and the tenacity to keep trying to solve these crimes. I mean, that's amazing to me.
When you're reading some of these things, do you kind of put yourself in that time or in that position in your imagination, and kind of, I guess, to what level are you kind of like the scientific objective or like the romantic that's kind of just into it and the story and the history?
Well, I like to, at the beginning of the shows, we give a little background of the town, the setting of where we're at in South Carolina, and then a little bit about the time period. Like if we're going back to 1991, they're probably listening to Mariah Carey on a hot new CD that just came out, and, watching Family Ties or whatever was on TV at that time. But I kind of, now that you mention it, go back in my head a little bit like that. And
kind of get the listener back into the time frame as well.
Right. Try to make it more interesting.
Yeah, that's really cool. Well, it seems like something that could take up a lot of your time if you let it, between the maybe traveling to different places and all that. What, with all these jobs and everything, how do you balance all this stuff, man?
Man, I've got a great wife.
Yeah.
And she supports me 100%. And I'm like, "Hey, babe, I'm gonna be in here researching, doing some things on the computer and trying to find some things for the podcast." And she will take care of everything. She'll insulate me in that little bubble.
That's pretty cool.
It's awesome. I've got the best one.
Is she into that stuff too? Does she have a shared interest in the history and the crime and all that?
Absolutely not. She could care. She could care less. Yes, and she's all into it. Now, when I'm in football mode in football season, she's all about that.
Okay.
But she says, you do your thing, you enjoy it, be happy, and I'll take care of the rest.
Wow.
So,
and the rest is, you have kids, right? How many kids?
We have a 16-year-old daughter and a 15-year-old foster daughter.
So there's a lot to take care of. When she says, "I'll take care of the rest," like there's, she's got her hands full.
Oh, she's great. She's great.
That's awesome.
But and both girls, they go to opposite high schools. We kept our foster daughter at Rock Hill just to make her feel comfortable. That's what she wants to do. And then our daughter goes to Northwestern, and of course we've got sports practices after school, so we're going in different directions, and it's a lot.
Yeah, y'all keep yourself busy, man. But I love that you're doing this. I love that you have a focus on South Carolina. I love that you have a focus on history, because these are, if you can't tell, I'm a big history nerd as well. And of course, being a lawyer, that's the lens that I look at these crimes through. So that's really interesting to me as well. But I just love that you're, carrying on something, like I mentioned, the oral tradition. I think it's super important to, keep these stories alive and make sure that, and really, I mean, you touched on it, but to me, I think one of the big things that's perhaps different about what y'all are doing is the approaching the stories with respect for the families involved and the victims, and not just for necessarily pure entertainment sake. Right. You know what I mean? It's okay. Let's make sure that there's humanity to it. And I think that's kind of, I don't want to say it's missing, because there are programs that do that well, but I think it's easy to overlook that. In other words, it's almost enticing to overlook it because it makes it easier. You're just looking at it from an entertainment standpoint.
Right.
It's a little bit harder when you're trying to be respectful to those victims and the families, right?
Right, and it's one thing to write it down on a piece of paper when you're doing your research, but found out in episode 1 just how hard it is to say some things.
Yeah,
and actually let it come out of your mouth what happened to these folks, and you feel so sorry. The mother of the young lady that was killed in episode 1, she just was such a tragic character. And she was quoted several years after as, I just exist.
Wow.
Without Crystal. I don't live. I just exist. And talking about how hard it would be for her to forgive her daughter's killer. And we got quotes from Kathy Ropp down at My Ori News about that, and that was just so heart-wrenching.
Yeah,
that I'm a softie.
I said, it's harder when you do care because you have to put yourself into that state.
Right.
So, is it hard for you to come out of that? Like once you've been in this intense research into something that's maybe a little morbid, maybe a little hard. Like, is it tough to just shut the computer down and be like, "Hey, honey, hey, kids," like? You almost have to snap out of it.
It is. And usually with all the activity going on in my house, it's pretty easy to jump in on the fly. There's always something to distract you. But last night, working on an episode we're going to record this weekend, I said, and it's going to be the most gut-wrenching one yet. It's about crimes against children. And I stopped and put my pen down last night, and I said, I can't believe I'm writing this sentence down on a piece of paper.
Yeah, especially as a father.
Oh yeah. And that boy, it's tough, but you gotta turn it on and turn it off. And luckily, I have enough chaos in my household to help me do that really quickly.
It distracts you pretty quick, I'm sure.
Right.
But again, I kind of keep touching on it, but that's where I think if you're going to be the one to tell the story, and I feel like somebody should, it's important to do it that way. I feel like,
right.
And so when you're telling the story and you're putting it in a digital format and you put it online, it's there forever.
Right.
I mean, now it's there and it's not relying on somebody telling someone from one generation to the next or someone going to the library and reading a book. You're putting these stories out there in a digital format that's a lot more accessible to people that they don't even know where to start, I'm sure, for most people to find these stories and research them on their own. But you're sharing a part of, the South Carolina, the human experience of people that have lived here, that I think is really important that people understand or these stories continue. So yeah, I'm kind of like grateful that you're doing it. I think it's pretty awesome. Not just for the entertainment value, like I said, but just because the stories I think are important.
And getting back to the compassionate side, I think we got that, both Danielle and I, from the books of Rita Schiller and from being able to speak with her, the forensic photographer. Yeah. Because that was her motivating factor, was to bring peace to these families. And with speaking with her over the last week, we've actually had several phone conversations, and there's a neat case. I feel awful saying that. That's a neat case, but it was a murder that happened in the Low Country in 1978. It was one of Rita's first cases, and it remained cold for 37 years. And finally, the victim's family, they pressed and pressed so hard, please, her siblings, before we pass away, try to get us some kind of peace. Can you please put a detective just to relook at everything? And so this is in 2015, and the detective, he calls Rita Schiller, and this lady that resembles, Sophia from the Golden Girls, she puts on her leather jacket. She's like, all right, I'm game. Let's go.
Wow.
And jumps right back into it.
Wow.
And they solved it.
Wow.
So, and she said that was the close to an open chapter in her life.
And the killer was still alive, or were they able to?
The killer was still alive.
Wow.
And we talked a little bit about technology earlier and how they got so focused on the DNA, and the samples that they had from 1978 were so convoluted.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, Rita said, wait a minute. She said, and of course, the local police department, they didn't have the fingerprints. They had thrown those out years ago. And she said, wait a minute. When I was with SLED, I remember working on this, and let me call somebody. And she called SLED's offices and said, go in my old studio, look at my file cabinet. Now, she's 71 years old. In the third drawer, about 3/4 of the way back, and see if you can find this file. I bet those negatives of those fingerprints are in there.
Unbelievable.
And they were.
Happen to be? Oh, my God.
And in the meantime, between 1978 and 2015,
they were still there.
This man had been arrested, and they had his fingerprints in now the national database, which they didn't have back in 1978.
Yeah.
So she was able to get these negatives she had and remembered right where she had put them in 1978.
She's a superhero.
She is a superhero.
That's unbelievable.
Yeah. I mean, that blew my mind. But her main goal, her main driving factor in that case was to bring peace to that family.
Yeah.
So that's her motivation, and we take inspiration from that as well.
That's so cool. And for her, it just seems like an unbelievable passion because it's her job. She writes about it. It's
right.
like her on the side hobby interest. It sounds like she's just lives and breathes that world.
Well, a lot like my co-host.
Yeah.
I mean, she went to school for criminology at University of South Carolina, and she loves the true crime, always has, and now she works for SLED, and she's made it her livelihood.
Wow.
So
that's so cool.
Special people.
Yeah, so you're taping these episodes once a week? Is that what you're doing?
We're releasing one a week.
Okay.
We get together and I roll my eyes a little bit. We try to record 5.
Oh, wow.
At a time, but
that's a marathon, man.
Yeah, we found that out real early.
Trent's over here pulling his hair out. He's like, I can't imagine.
Yeah, we found out real early that
that's ambitious.
After about 3, we hit a wall.
Yeah, for sure.
So
the quality, I'm sure, starts to go down a little bit if you try to go too many.
Right.
Man, I don't have that kind of stamina. I get done after about 45 minutes of talking. I'm like, oh well, that's pretty impressive. I think we've done. What's the longest we've done? Like 2 hours? Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, I can't imagine for 5 hours. Even I mean, I'm a lawyer. I talk for a living. I can't imagine doing that for 5 hours.
And we're taking breaks too. We're taking ad breaks and standing up a little bit. And I thought I had to go to the orthopedist earlier this week because I said, honey, I was telling my wife I don't know what's wrong with my legs. I don't know what's wrong with the back of my legs. And then I started realizing, hey, I was sitting in this chair, sitting on the edge of my chair. And it was just digging in for so long into the back of this uncushioned chair.
You had a podcast injury.
Yeah, I had a podcast injury. That's stupid.
That's right.
Yeah, I got injured sitting in a chair. That's how bad I am.
That's when you get older, man. Like you wake up from a nap with an injury, you know?
That's right.
I got a napping injury. Well, that's exciting. So when you're releasing one a week, is it Fridays? Is it Saturdays? What day can people anticipate new episodes?
Mondays.
Mondays.
Okay. So this coming Monday is going to be episode 4 coming out. Mm-hmm. We dropped our first 3 this past Monday, and episode 4, actually, like I said, this is going to be a disturbing one. And unfortunately, I knew the assailant.
Oh, wow.
Went to college with him.
Wow.
And this is going to be a toughie.
Citadel grad?
He was.
Wow.
He was. So this is going to be a toughie, and we haven't recorded it yet, so I can't really tell you how gut-wrenching it'll be, but hearing some of those words coming out of my mouth and knowing that I knew this guy for 3 years, he was a year behind me at the Citadel, it's going to tear me up. No, he was in the same battalion. Okay. So, I mean, technically we slept under the same roof.
Wow.
I slept under the same roof with this monster.
Wow.
And I don't know what I can say on here or not, but
no signs of any crazy.
He's different.
Different.
I mean, I really didn't have much to do with him, but we'll get into that on the episode.
Nice. Okay. Well, we'll look forward to it. Matt, thanks for coming out, man. I can't wait to keep listening and hear more. And yeah, anytime you want to come back, come on back.
I will, in this posh environment you've created here. This is outstanding. But thank you so much for having me on, and thank you for all you do.
Yeah, my pleasure, man. Thank you.